I would like to welcome you to the fourth session, the narrative competition and how the media is shaping the South China Sea. My name is Rodion Ebbighausen, and I would like to thank the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and the Foundation of East Asia Studies and Vietnam's Lawyers Association for making this or taking this conference happening. This is great. And I would like to remind the speakers and me as well that as there are interpreters working and translating what we say, we should from time to time slow down and give them a break so that they can translate what we say. So to start with the session, so we all know that there is a very difficult relationship between the world as it is and the world as people see it through the eyes of reporters, researchers, politicians, military personnel, etc., etc. And all these perspectives somehow shape the perception and the thinking about the South China Sea. And I'm very honored to have the chance to discuss or to listen or to understand the forming power of journalism with regard to the South China Sea. With great colleagues who have a broad expertise in this regard. And I would like to introduce the first panelist to you. So Humphrey Hawksley is going to speak first. He's an author and former BBC Beijing bureau chief. And his latest book is Asian Waters, The Struggle Over the Indo-Pacific and the Challenge to American Power. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here with the Diplomatic Academy. I'm about to do a screen share, so let's hope the technology moves through that. And I'm going to use my time to talk about the repercussions of unpredictable events. So let's see if this can work. And then... And if you're seeing that, I can begin. So, I mean, essentially, I'm going to talk about what Mao Zedong called a prairie fire. A single spark can start a prairie fire. That's a black swan, the surprise, that miscalculation or something that flares up. It's a grassroots public demand, usually in the form of a punishment or a power projection. So one of the extreme examples of a prairie fire is 9/11 that led the US into a series of Middle East wars. Now, a prairie fire is nothing new. And I wanted to go back to the late 19th century when the British controlled city of Khartoum in Sudan was besieged by Islamic rebels. The Prime Minister, William Gladstone, did not send reinforcements, and Charles Gordon, the general that you see at the top of those steps, was killed, the city overrun, and his head impaled on a spike. The media was merciless. There were pictures of Great Britain in shame, terrible massacres, women and children not spared. And by the end of that year, William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, was out of office. Now, let's get to a situation that is familiar to us all. The Vietnam War, and this very famous picture was a prairie fire. Among the most memorable, the little girl running away from her village that had just been napalmed in 1972. That photograph fed into the American democratic system to a critical mass of people that the war in Vietnam was a bad thing. And those people in a Western democracy are voters. A similar situation a generation on in Iraq with the Abu Ghraib photographs of the mistreatment of prisoners. The war in Iraq was not about bringing democracy to the Middle East. No longer, it was a bad thing. Now, around the Indo-Pacific region, as it's called now, South China Sea at the center, there are a number of potential prairie fires, which many of us are familiar with. India, Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, others. Most critical, in my view, is the Uyghur Muslims in the camps in Xinjiang. The watchtowers there, the element of ethnic discrimination, slots into a Western narrative that China is not just a rising power, it's more like Germany in the 1930s as a rising power. A single image, for example, of a fire that sweeps through one of those camps could be a mistaken fire, of an execution, dozens dead, a beating, would race around the world creating demands from Western democracies that politicians must act. Now, with all those elements that I just mentioned, and with Huawei and with the trade war and everything, there is a narrative being drawn that crosses social, readership, geographical divides. Here, the Washington Post a year ago, in China, every day is Kristallnacht. That was November 1938, that horrific night that Germany openly moved against the Jewish community. In the Daily Express, a tabloid newspaper in Britain, how dare China spy on our vaccine labs? All of these things moving into a single story. It's as if China itself is losing control of its own narrative, certainly in the eyes of Western democracies. And what happens historically in these cases is that it's a kind of Hollywood movie thing. So the leaders of these nations become epitomized as bullying, authoritarian bad guys. Fidel Castro, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and Xi Jinping is edging towards that. There is a risk that that might happen, that these are simply evil people who need to go. Those who remember the Middle East wars will understand that phrase, the compelling portrayal of a dictatorial monster, and that will bring voters behind anti-China policies. Now, this is exactly what Asia is seeking to avoid. And I wanted to wrap up with a prairie fire, which is familiar to many, I'm sure, at this conference. The original story of the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 was that the US Navy was intercepted by North Vietnamese patrol boats in an exchange of fire. It was later revealed that the confrontation was fabricated, or at least not as it was portrayed. And here is a drab image, it's not an image of the war, a drab image of Western democracy at work. The Senate passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with just 2 opposing votes. House of Representatives was unanimous. President Johnson here is signing the bill, paving the way for the Vietnam War, based on, however we want to see it, faulty intelligence, or did the means justify the end to win the war against, global war against communism, or was it simply fake news? Now, for Western governments dealing with voter opinion and 24-hour news cycles, a prairie fire in today's world among China's many flashpoints is becoming increasingly likely. And at that stage, the geopolitical and legal complexities that we heard in the last session will be swept away against television pictures of, say, concentration camps in Xinjiang, or imagine a young American sailor's body shot up by Chinese guns, prompting public pressure that something must be done. The media is a circular process of voter sentiment, winning elections, spinning policy, and politicians both leading and following the media. You only need to look at Fox News or China's Global Times to see what I mean by this. So don't blame the media, because that is it's using it as a scapegoat. It's the duty for all of us to know how these things work. The more we understand, the less we are likely to find that there's a miscalculation or an event that leads to a catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Humphrey, for this very interesting presentation and reminding us or showing us how journalism is preparing a stage, or preparing a stage where narratives connect or not connect, and how this changes the perception. So I would like to invite Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran from the Wilson Center's Asia program to give his presentation. He produces analysis on Southeast Asia, political and security issues. And he's also a director at the consultancy Bauer Group Asia and a senior columnist at the Diplomat. Thank you. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Rodion. And let me thank the organizers for the invitation, as well as the continued advancement of the South China Sea agenda within the conference series, which is always a really important forum to talk about these issues. So I'm going to focus my remarks in the limited time that I have just around two sets of issues. One is getting at the complexities of narrative competition in the South China Sea, which I think we've kind of gotten to already in the sessions, and I'm sure other presenters will talk about, and then how we manage those complexities. And I think where I want to start is actually where Mr. Hawksley left off earlier, which is the sort of conception of blame in the media, which I think is important to address at the forefront. I think, you know, having a number of roles now, including previously at the Diplomat as an editor and now at a consultancy and a think tank, I think too often we put too much of the blame and too much of the pressure on the media. We paint it with too broad of a brush. I think nowadays when you talk about the media, you're talking about news outlets that are global in nature, some that are regional. Within Southeast Asia, institutions like New Narrative, for example, are changing the way people are talking about certain issues. And you also have brands, individuals who have their own media presence, consultancies, newspapers, newsletters by individuals as well are taking their own sort of traction in the media landscape. So we have to be very clear about who we're talking about. I also think it is very unreasonable, I think, to a certain degree, to expect the same level of granularity and expertise that you have at think tanks and consultancies from the media. I think anyone who's worked in the media will tell you it's not that, for example, you know, it's that people don't understand the distinction between islands or rocks, or they make mistakes with respect to an exclusive economic zone in a particular story or article. These people are cranking out articles, you know, sometimes by the hour or by a few minutes, whereas scholars and academics have months, weeks, and sometimes years to crank out, you know, individual journal articles or sometimes books. So I think the way that we judge the media also has to be, you know, take that into account with respect to that. And I think the third thing is appreciating organizational complexity. I think, you know, when I used to edit and write for the Diplomat on a full-time basis, I used to be very, you know, worried when I used to produce articles and I would get publications from Malaysia, for example, saying the Diplomat says that the South China Sea is, you know, evolving in this particular way. This is actually my own personal opinion that I'm writing for a particular outlet. But the idea is that a particular outlet has taken an organizational position relative to an individual actually expressing his particular view or opinion. So the difference between an opinion versus an organizational opinion versus news needs to be struck there as well. So I think those are some considerations I wanted to lay out in the beginning about how complex that dynamic is with respect to the media. But with respect to the complexities of narrative competition in the South China Sea, I would say there's four to my mind that are significant. And I would summarize them by looking at what I might call the four Ds. You know, one is definitional. I think the South China Sea is a highly technical and very high profile issue. And that's a particular problematic, challenging area for the media to cover. So the distinction between, as I mentioned, a rock versus an island, EEZs, who's a claimant, who's not a claimant, who's saying that they are not a claimant, but they effectively are a claimant. These are issues that are very difficult for media outlets and organizations to address. So the first is definitional. The second, I would say, is differential. There's a huge, vast narrative differential range in the South China Sea. I mean, we have the notion of China and China's assertiveness, a narrative that took hold in 2008, 2009, that some scholars have picked apart and asked the question, where did this really come from? How do we define it? How do we talk about it? There's another narrative about outside actors that are not part of the region, including the United States, being troublemakers in the South China Sea, in spite of the fact that the United States and other outside actors say this is an international issue. There's no distinction between regional versus international actors. And there's another narrative that's taken hold in the last few years with respect to the South China Sea being a hotspot in an ongoing Cold War between the United States and China. And that is particularly problematic for claimant states because it removes them of necessary agency and makes this a very simplified bipolar competition, despite the differences between what we see today and what we saw during the Cold War. So that's the second problem. The third problem is how dynamic the situation is. I've been personally very struck by how we have these very clear narratives and characterizations and how they really ebb and flow very quickly. One aspect of this is the sort of narrative with respect to international legal frameworks and the international rule of law that we saw with respect to the lead up of the arbitral tribunal ruling. And we saw, front page headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post about China's island building activities. But subsequently, after the ruling, and in my view personally, the failure of several international actors, including the United States, to follow up on some of the commitments that had been made implicitly or explicitly led to a huge reduction in the level of high profile coverage in terms of this legal international component with respect to the South China Sea. Now, we've seen it recover since then. I don't want to discount that. But I do want to note the level and extent of coverage that we had before the ruling and what we saw in the evolution after the ruling that gave rise to this notion that the South China Sea and the legal approach has somehow taken a big beating and it's been diminished. Even though, as we know, the facts really haven't changed. It's an example of how the narrative seems to have evolved from where we were back in 2016. And the fourth thing I would note is that in reality, there's very significantly diverse narrative environments in each of these countries in the South China Sea, including the claimant states, right? So you have the Philippines, where sometimes it's often joked that there are many more newspapers than opinions. But you also have the other case of Brunei, for example, where it's very easy to get a sense of what the government narrative is. But to get a sense of what society is thinking, or to what extent there are divergences within the government, it's actually very difficult to get a sense of that, right? So we're talking about very different environments depending on which country we're talking about in the South China Sea. How to manage these complexities, which I want to spend, maybe a quick minute or two on. As with any competition, I think it rests on drawing clear contours around what the context of the competition is, who the players are, and what the rules are. I think we need to have a lot more transparency. Without naming names, I think we kind of all know what we're talking about here. Who are individuals' affiliations? What are their sources? What are their funding, right? I think these are basic issues that you ask of every single media organization, every single actor in every context. The South China Sea shouldn't be immune from that. I think a second one is fact checking. Calling out, there are opinions and narratives, but there are also facts. So if there are wrong facts or statistics that are being reported, those need to be talked about. We have talked about it and seen a number of articles and outlets about the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, the South China Sea Probing Initiative, and so on and so forth. So I don't have to go into the details here, but it is important to figure out what is opinion and what is fact. I think the third thing we need to figure out is what are the bounds at which we're defining the stakeholders in the South China Sea. We talked about the media, but we're now also talking about journalists, we're talking about academics. We should broaden the aperture of that to talk about public opinion more generally. The state of public opinion in Southeast Asia more generally is actually not up to the mark, right? So we have the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies that publishes elite opinion on major issues, including touching on geopolitical issues like the South China Sea. But if you try to get beyond elite opinion to public opinion, the quality and the extent of that varies across Southeast Asian countries. So that's one thing. And then one final thing I would say is just approaching this from the point of humility and caution, right? Narratives ultimately are simplified stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell others. So starting from the point of view that others may have different stories to tell with their own biases, with their own half-truths, and distinguishing between what is fact and what is opinion is going to be very important, not just today, but in the context of the next few years when we have negotiations on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. We talk about resource sharing agreements, and we deal with the conceptions of disputes not only between claimant states, but also outside actors like the United States and other European countries as well. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the other presentations as well as the questions in the comment section of this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this well-structured and interesting presentation touching on a lot of issues. So I would like to introduce now Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro. She's Center a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at the Stanford University, and her research focus is on Chinese military and security policy and Asia-Pacific security issues. And she's also a foreign and defense policy fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Please, you have the floor. Hello? Can you? I don't know. Does anybody hear her or me? Can you hear me?
I think she's vanished, Rod, from the...
She's vanished? Okay, so maybe we change the order and hope that she can reconnect. I got a call here now. So 1 second from the organ. So sorry for that. So we have to rearrange the order. So Dr. Mastro has to restart her computer. So then we can continue to David Hutt, and he can give his presentation first. So he has been a South Asia columnist at the Diplomat since 2016. He was formerly based in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and he also writes for Foreign Policy, Asia Times, Nikkei Asian Review, South China Morning Post, and other international publications. David, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me, and good morning from Europe. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. What I want to speak about today is a more broader issue in this debate, which is the role of the media is supposed to play, intentionally or unintentionally, in what scholars call the clash of narratives over the South China Sea. How the media informs or escalates nationalism, and how it escalates tensions between rival claimants. My focus here is on the ethics of journalism. And the question I ask is whether the media should feel any responsibility for escalating tensions, and whether the media should intentionally try to de-escalate tensions. Put more simply, do journalists have any responsibility for the consequences of their reporting? In recent years, I've sensed a creeping consecrationism in our industry, which I'm no fan of. And it's heard in one of the talking points for today's panel discussion, which is, quote, what roles the media should play to promote peace, stability, and rule of law in the South China Sea. I believe this is fine for academic debate, but it would be wrong for us in the media to think that we have a duty to promote peace or stability. In the same way, it would be wrong for us to think that we have a duty to promote instability or conflict. When speaking about ethics, we must consider the narrative competition over the South China Sea as being played out across wildly different kinds of media. In Vietnam and China, we have state-run media in which the narratives are strongly controlled by the respective communist parties. In states like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, the media is split between independent outlets and a dominant pro-ruling party outlets. And then into the mix, we also have the international and Western media. However, irrespective of who owns or controls the media, I think they should be guided by 3 principles. First and foremost is to provide readers with facts and figures, news on current events without bias and objectivity. Second, to be a conduit by which politicians and experts can communicate with ordinary people, ordinary readers. And third, to provide analysis of those objective facts in order for readers to understand broader issues that surround the events. I would say that the consequence of reporting is not one of these principles for the media. I think we can all agree that the media does have influence on tensions in the South China Sea, either by inflaming nationalism or escalating the tensions. But if we're going to if we journalists are going to be asked to consider the consequences of what we write, then not only does this radically change the nature of our profession, it means that no longer is the truth what matters, it's how the truth is interpreted. Am I, for example, when reporting on the South China Sea, not supposed to write about a nationalist speech given by a Chinese government official in case this incites such beliefs in the wider public? In many ways, this issue bypasses the issue of truthful or misleading reporting, because objective reporting of, say, Chinese vessels surveying the waters near the Vanguard Bank can stir up nationalism in Vietnam and escalate anger towards Beijing, but that is a factual reporting. But if we are to consider the consequences of that factual reporting, we may decide to lie or mislead, or not simply to report on China's activity in the South China Sea, because by doing so, that might de-escalate the kind of anti-China nationalism we see in Vietnam, but it would be certainly putting the truth second. Someone once said that the most corrupting desire to afflict a journalist is the urge to give readers what they want. I would say that an equally corrupting desire is not to tell the readers the truth in case it angers them. We have a duty not to lie or distort the truth, but we hobble ourselves when we start to consider how that truth is interpreted by readers. And just as it would be wrong to say that the media should take an active decision to escalate tensions, it would also be wrong to argue that the media should actively take a decision to de-escalate tensions, which might require the bending of the truth. And my argument I'm making isn't a purely ethical one or hypothetical one. It strikes me that one of the main problems of state-run media in Vietnam or in China is that the journalists are asked to be overly obsessed with consequences, how the reporting affects the reputation of their communist parties, how their reporting impacts Vietnam or China's reputation in international relations. And having reported on Vietnam for the previous 6 years, the Vietnamese Communist Party has instructed the state-run media on several occasions to downplay tensions with China, aware of what the consequences would be if this was honestly reported. The media's coverage of, say, the anniversaries of the Third Indochina War between Vietnam and China is usually intentionally light, the rare exception being last year when the state-run media were allowed to report on it extensively. However, several studies by academics have found that independent blogs, which we now see rising and growing and becoming more predominant in places like Vietnam and China, are often taking a far more nationalistic narrative than their state-run counterparts, which we might call the polarization of the media in such countries. But why is it polarized? Well, one reason is because the state-run media is overly obsessed with the consequences of honest reporting, and this has provoked a backlash and opened up space for far more aggressive and assertive and say nationalist blogs, which then perpetuate this narrative. So if there is going to be more, say, media responsibility in places like Vietnam and across Southeast Asia and in China, especially regarding the South China Sea, one of the reasons for this polarization is the dominance of overly thinking about the consequences of reporting. Here, I think it's perhaps my duty as an independent journalist who reports on Southeast Asia to mention the state of media in Vietnam, from the arrest of journalists like Pham Chi Dung of the Independent Journalists Association of Vietnam, and the more recent arrest and detention of Pham Do Trang, I believe that's said. But here's my central argument, which is it's often said that Chinese or Vietnamese or academic media, American media escalates tensions in the South China Sea by perpetuating narratives because the journalists who are biased towards either their own governments or their own nations' narratives, or they want to champion certain parts of society, the more nationalist parts of society. But that is because those journalists are asked to be obsessed or asked to always consider the consequences of a reporting and not necessarily the truth. And we cannot correct the one consecrationist reporting with another by suggesting that all media has to intentionally try to de-escalate tensions in the South China Sea. Do I have much more time, or is that nearing the end?
I'm not sure. You have to ask the organizers. They usually, you have a watch or a timer in the top of your screen.
Yes, yes. Yes, I'll just finish quickly on maybe a bit of personal experience. I was based in Cambodia between 2014 and 2019. I left to return to Europe last year. In late 2018, I wrote an article for the Asia Times that kickstarted or began the debate about whether China is secretly trying to build a naval base in Cambodia, or what appears more likely now is trying to allow its troops to be based on Cambodian soil. Phnom Penh, the Phnom Penh government has consistently denied this, but it is taken seriously in Washington, and it is a great source of tensions now between Cambodia and the US. We saw this last week when the Cambodian government tore down another US-built facility in the Ream Naval Base, which is Cambodia's largest in Sihanoukville. This is an important issue for the South China Sea because if it is proven true and Chinese troops are able to be based on Cambodian soil and therefore the Gulf of Siam, then Vietnam would be surrounded and Chinese vessels would be much closer to the territory claimed by Malaysia and Indonesia. Now, when reporting on this, I had colleagues and acquaintances in Cambodia who asked me to consider the consequences of this. They said that if it was reported, regardless of whether it's true or not, that it was affecting the country's reputation and especially its relations with America. And if the American government wanted to proceed fully, this would harm Cambodian interests and possibly lead to sanctions on economic trade. So the consequences of this reporting could be serious for ordinary Cambodians. I felt the consequences. I was slandered in the media, and I left the country last year after I heard I was close to being expelled or worse. But I decided not to listen to the consequences. I decided that the Cambodian people would face more harm if they didn't understand the truth, or they weren't informed about the truth, or they weren't informed about what was happening in the capitals of other countries and what was being discussed. So I guess I finished by saying that if the narrative now surrounding the greater narrative of South China Sea is that journalists must be held to be responsible or held to the consequence of what their reporting brings, and this is a very bad thing for our profession. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. So I would like to, thank you for addressing this issue of lack of press freedom in the region and how this can contribute to polarization, and that trying to control the situation might make it worse or more difficult. And so now I would like to ask Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro to do her presentation. I can introduce you once again. Like, she's Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at the Stanford University, and she is focused on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, and she's also Foreign and Defense Policy Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, and I apologize. I've gone in and out. I've been having some connectivity issues. So can everyone hear me now okay?
I can hear you clearly, perfect.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so unfortunately, because I was unable to connect on my computer, I won't be able to show my PowerPoint, but I will be able to speak through some of the findings that I had. As was mentioned, my background is a little bit different. I'm a China military specialist. I am not a media specialist per se. So today I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese media and its coverage of the South China Sea, and in particular, the role that the media has in shaping the environment and being a mouthpiece for the Chinese military. Part of a larger project, I have done an analysis of the past year of China's military behavior in the South China Sea, its exercises, its deployments of weapon systems, and then its discourse. So what the Chinese media says about the South China Sea. As other panelists have mentioned, there's this narrative that China has become more aggressive since the COVID shutdowns of March. What I have found in my research is actually the bottom line is that the Chinese military hasn't changed that much in terms of the quantity of things that they do. Now, they have increased the number of exercises and deployments, but this is a predictable linear increase. Every year they increase incrementally. What's very different this year is the role of the media in helping the PLA signal specifically to the United States a few capabilities. So there's sort of three main takeaways or points that I want to highlight here. The first is, as we know, the Chinese media is not a free press. And so in many cases, the Chinese media is used to emphasize certain points of the government. And so for the first time in the South China Sea disputes, the media has been used to highlight specific messages to the United States to try to enhance deterrence to the United States. Now, US activities under President Trump in the South China Sea have increased significantly this year. There have been more FONOPs, or freedom of navigation operations of the United States, in the first half of 2020 than during the whole Obama administration. So there is an uptick, an increase in activities on both sides. If you look at the media, it's very interesting. There's a number of reasons I think it's being used as this signaling device. The first is that Chinese military exercises are happening immediately after a US activity in the South China Sea. This is not to suggest that the Chinese are responding to the US, because these exercises and activities are pre-planned, but China is trying to suggest that they are defensive and reactive, and these are the messages that they're funneling through the media after they engage in some sort of activity or exercise. The second pattern I see in the media, which is very interesting, is a over-publicizing Chinese military capabilities in the South China Sea. So there have been even recently a number of videos that you will see the Chinese media promoting of a fighter.
Excuse me, the connection seems to be poor. I can't hear you anymore. Hello, can you hear us? Maybe we wait for some seconds to give her a chance to. She has dropped out, at least what I can see from my place.
We are trying to reconnect.
Okay, yeah, we wait a minute and try to reconnect.
Mr. Moderator, may I suggest that we move to the next speaker, and then when we resume the connection, we can go back to the presentation.
Okay, so the organizers told me that we have to stick to the time plan. So please, I have now the honor to introduce Christine Huang she's correspondent at the China desk of the South China Morning Post, and focuses on diplomacy and defense, as she joined the Post in 2016 and previously reported for the China Review news agency. And yeah, Christine is interested in security in Northeast Asia and China's growing military might. You have the floor, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
I'm very honored to be a panelist here in this summit. And I regularly write stories on South China Sea issues. But today, I'm not talking about stories or analysis I have written in the past. Oh, Oriana,
1 second,
I
I'm
see you
sorry.
again.
You're back. I don't know. Would you like to continue, Oriana? I'm sorry, it's a bit. I don't know what. Would you like to continue, or do we? Because it's. I don't know. It's a bit difficult now to keep up with the flow.
No, I totally understand. Zoom keeps kicking me off. I don't know. Maybe, you know, the Chinese don't like what I have to say or something. But every 5 minutes they kick me off of Zoom for some reason. I don't want to, I guess, take too much time and interrupt. And maybe just while I have like another minute, I'll just say that. If I have a PowerPoint which I've shared that just shows that there's a number of upticks in the media responses after these incidents. They're after the timing of U.S. operations. They highlight warnings to the United States to say that this is because of the United States. And I was in the process of describing the capabilities that the media is over exaggerating China's military capabilities, and the Chinese military is using the media to release some videos of flights and things, which some US analysts say might never have happened, but that this is new because usually China tries to downplay their military capabilities. Now through the media, they're trying to over exaggerate them. And my bottom line assessment is I think they're trying to demonstrate capability to the United States, to try to deter the United States from becoming more militarily engaged, to increase the cost of US military support to other claimants in the region. And they are using, you know, primarily their nationalistic media tools like the Global Times to try to signal that they are more capable and they're more willing to use force against the United States than they have in the past. And so this is a different angle on the media than some of the other speakers. But I think it's important to note that at least in China, the media is part of their strategy to gain control over the South China Sea, and they continue to use it in new and innovative ways. So thank you, and I apologize for, like I said, keep on getting kicked off of Zoom, and sorry, Kristen, for interrupting.
Okay, so hopefully you can stay for the Q&A. So now, Christine, sorry you have to restart again, but you have the floor now.
Hi, everyone. I'm not to talk about the stories or analysis I have written in the past. I picked social media as the topic I'm going to say. For most of us, social media is an indispensable part of our daily lives. We post our source, alert emergencies, interact with friends, and get useful information on platforms like WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But for millions of internet users in Chinese living inside the Chinese mainland, life is a bit different. The world's most popular social networking services cannot be easily accessed because of strict censorship in China, leaving only the Chinese equivalents like Xinjiang Weibo and Qzone to serve the country with the largest internet users on Earth. The censorship that filters information flow between the Chinese mainland and the outside world is commonly known as the Great Firewall. What I'm going to say is not arguing for or against this controversial mechanism, but to show from a media perspective that the creation has hampered China's effort to engage with the outside world, leaving China a victim of its own policies. And the South China Sea issue is one case in point. Due to the censorship, the number of Chinese accounts is significantly smaller than those in the West. On the South China Sea issue, for example, people and agencies in the United States and Vietnam have countless accounts in social media platforms like Twitter to engage with the outside world, to shape public opinion, and to spread a preferred narrative. Take the famous Asian Maritime and Transparency Initiative as an example. It monitored for years via satellite images regarding China's activities in building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and alerted the international community about China putting weapons on those islands. Their discoveries have huge influences and and forced China to respond many times. One of his latest twists introduced a searchable map of every feature in the South China Sea, with links to satellite images from its island tracker and filters to toggle by occupier and legal status. In this way, AMTI turns Twitter into a very powerful tool to reach out to people and shape public opinion. Well, for China, China is relatively a newcomer to those social media arena. Similar to AMTI, China's SCSPI, full-named the South China Sea Strategic Situation Probing Initiative, a Beijing-based think tank, is now an active player in Twitter and gained some attention recently. SCSPI periodically releases reports on U.S. naval vessel and warplanes trails and Vietnamese fishing boats' so-called illegal fishing activities in China's waters. It interacts with other accounts too. However, if we compare the quality tweets posted by AMTI and SCSPI, we can easily see AMTI has reached out to more people and organizations and is regarded as a more reliable source than SCSPI. For Chinese state media and their overseas branches, although they have accounts in social media platforms too, but their influences are far lagging behind other world's renowned media agencies. Take People's Daily as example. It has 7 million followers, but their tweets rarely got 3-digit retweets, a sharp contrast to CNN or Fox News. Yes, there are deeper reasons causing this situation, but this example tells us China lacks their voices in international platform. The absence of or the limited China's voices in the international social media platforms like Twitter makes Beijing difficult to spread their own voices. An unexpected result caused by its infamous censorship system, the Great Firewall. Beijing might have never expected that one day they would turn out to be a victim of its own policies. And I should say, I expect this situation to last because China would continue this censorship for its own needs. Like any cyberspace in the world, the Chinese cyberspace is a complicated and contentious space. Over the years, the Chinese propaganda apparatus recognized the importance of communicating in ways that appeal to the younger generation online, and decades have passed since the introduction of the Great Firewall. Studies have already discovered that the Great Firewall's existence have made the Chinese more nationalistic than before. This can be observed from what overseas Chinese students have done when Hong Kong was undergoing social unrest last year. In Australia, 2 student groups, one from Chinese mainland and one from Hong Kong, clashed with each other during a pro-democracy protest at the University of Queensland in Brisbane in July last year. These incidents show that young Chinese, once conduits for new ideas and challenges, are increasingly part of Beijing's patriotic operation, even when they are outside the Chinese mainland. Digital nationalism is a hot topic now. In a book called China's Digital Nationalism, written by Florian Schneider, a senior lecturer specializing in modern China studies from Leiden University in the Netherlands, said China's censorship framed nationalistic discourse online, which is intricately combined with the political economy of the internet, platforms, commercial bias, and design choices. Nationalistic sentiment among Chinese youth have always been strong in certain areas of national security, especially when it concerns sovereignty or territorial issues such as the South China Sea. But one last trivial update about the web browser in China that can cross the Great Firewall gave some hope. A Chinese browser called Tuber has begun allowing limited and heavily censored access to some US social media sites that are normally blocked on the mainland, including the YouTube. So let's hope there is one day that China can find ways to effectively bridge the gap and communicate with the outside world, no matter with or without the Great Firewall. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Christine, for your presentation. So we have some time left for Q&A, and if you allow me, I would like to try to wrap up some of what was said, and so that you can think about questions to ask you. I get it via my mobile phone or here. So I think there are several hurdles in the South China Sea and the reporting about the South China Sea. As Dr. Prashanth has explained, there is this hurdle of complexity and abstraction. So it's the topic itself is very difficult, and it's very difficult to bring it across to the audience and to explain everything. And then there is a hurdle like a lack of first-hand information. So usually if there is something going on, a journalist can fly there, see it with his own eyes, which is very difficult in the South China Sea, as there are lots of airports, but no civil airports. So it's really difficult to get first-hand information. Then there is the hurdle, which Christine pointed to, like the bridging, or there is a perception gap, like what people in Vietnam see and know about the South China Sea is different from what people in China see and in other parts. And somehow media have the job to bridge this gap, which is very difficult. And of course, as David pointed out, there is the lack and the difficulties of press freedom all around the South China Sea in more or lesser degrees, which is very difficult to make reliable, good reporting. And of course, as Humphrey pointed out, that there could be one incident or one event from which all things spiral out of control, at least if it's reported. And this is because the whole situation is so tense and so difficult. So maybe we can discuss these questions a little bit more in detail. Are there any questions? So I would like to open the floor for more questions. So let's see, I might get some through WhatsApp. Okay, so here is a question by Ahmed Kassam. Can the speakers, so one of you who knows most about it, advise how the African continent, which has received intense cooperation from China and is now also getting renewed attention from ASEAN countries, affect China-African, ASEAN-African relations? So that would be a question. I don't know who feels comfortable in answering this. My expertise regarding Africa is not so good.
A lot about China and Africa and done those events, so I could say a line on it, if that helps. I mean, essentially in Africa, you get to the development question, and the Chinese model of development, and the idea of the autocratic state building roads and hospitals and that sort of thing, whereas the democratic state focused on democracy and gender equality and that. So if you go to Liberia or Sierra Leone or Tanzania or places like that, it's saying, well, look, they've come in and they've built us a hospital and they've built us a road. So we don't think that your style of democracy has necessarily helped us over this past 20 or 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And if as this begins to play out, and as I mentioned in my thing about the sort of the good against evil, or democracy against dictatorship, this is where the balance is, because those very poor countries want a bridge over a stream or a river so the children can get to school or to a clinic. They don't necessarily want the sort of high-minded messages that come from the Western democratic elite. So I suspect that parts of Africa will be told to decide on one or the other, and there's a big risk that they would, in the event of a sort of global Cold War, a lot of them would side naturally with China.
Okay, thank you. There is another question by Junhu Pan. Please ask your question.
Okay, I want to point to one thing. Mr. Humphrey Hosling, you just showed some pictures as an illustration, but there I noticed one picture, is completely false. I'm sorry to say that. Notice the left, The second one, a man wearing a hat with the Chinese characters there. I don't know whether you know Chinese. You know, the Chinese character saying, shame of Japan. You know, that's the, protest of Chinese, against Japanese government purchase of the Senkaku Islands. I think in 2012. So it's a false picture. I don't know how you could build up your, your conclusion by the false picture. Okay, I think I have to point it out. Sorry, I have a question to go to, let's say, Ms. Huang. Ms. Huang. Okay, Ms. Huang, would you give us a comment on Trump administration ban of TikTok? Okay, that's a democratic state, yes? Okay, thank you.
Could I just address that in 2 seconds? Is that I think the question was absolutely right. They were demonstrations in 2012 in China against Japan over the Senkaku Islands. And they were just one of that composite of Chinese prairie fires or antagonism against China that happened. So I don't know what was false and what wasn't false in that, but that was the message that picture was meant to convey.
Okay, and Christine, can you maybe say something to the second part of the question?
Hi, Mr. Jin. I didn't hear your question clearly. Can you repeat your question?
I want to give your comment on Trump administration's ban of, TikTok.
Oh, you want to know my personal comments on Trump's ban on TikTok?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your question. I should say I never touched on this issue before on writing stories, but from a fake news perspective, I should say there were so many disinformation and misinformation circulating in TikTok. And I know TikTok is very, very popular in the States right now, and is very popular in Europe right now. I should say maybe Trump would feel endangered by the misinformation and disinformation campaign. And maybe there are some organized disinformation or misinformation in TikTok circulating and in its host, and that would endanger Trump's administration. But I'm not so sure. I'm not an insider in Trump's administration, so I cannot answer this question perfectly.
But one thing I want to know, TikTok is just for entertainment. It's not serious, Oh, everything is not serious there at all. Okay.
Maybe I would say something similar appears to be the case on Facebook, and this is just a personal friends-based, but I think it definitely has an impact and it is used. So I think the border between serious information and entertaining information has, due to social media, really blurred over the last couple of years, and which leads to that we have to address those issues on different platforms and in different ways. And of course, for example, you can see it in Thailand right now. The movement of the students is very entertaining, and it's making use a lot of social media, but it's talking about serious issues. For example, this is just one example. So I think this, you can't draw this line like this is serious media and this is just entertaining. This is might be a bit difficult. I have two other questions. There's one question, maybe I think Dr. Prashanth can answer it the best, is like how big or is the impact he thinks on the position of the US or the media in the US on the position of the US government towards the South China Sea, and how does it affect that?
Yeah, it's a good question, a very difficult question to answer, I think. I think on the one hand, it's it's one which is quite open and transparent. I think it's very easy to figure out where news outlets are getting the information from, and much more so than I think some of the Southeast Asian governments. It's easier to figure out what is more of news sources, stories that are coming out, rather than leaks that are planted by governments or particular officials within particular parts of the administration. That's more so, I guess, in the Trump administration relative to a more conventional U.S. administration. But nonetheless, I think that's one part of the equation. But I think the other aspect of it is there's less of a direct connection, though, to government policy. So in some of the other Southeast Asian countries, including some of the claimant countries, it's very easy to sort of take into account some media accounts and what you're seeing in newspapers and sort of conjecture that, oh, well, this is somehow related to the government or it's a government position. I think it's much less true in the U.S. context. I think in some cases it's almost as difficult to interpret as individual correspondents having their own views relative to a particular newspaper or a particular administration official. I would just say, I mean, a lot of the dynamics here are unique to a particular administration. So I know, for example, in the Obama administration, there were a lot of media reports, for example, about freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and to what extent this was, sort of reflective of U.S. government policy relative to some of the bureaucratic rivalries between the Pentagon and the State Department and what the Obama administration and the president was thinking himself. I think under the Trump administration, that's been a little bit more muddied. So it'd be more interesting to see under a Biden administration whether we see a return to that normalcy that we saw before, or whether we'll see a little bit more of a muddied concept with respect to how the South China Sea issue is treated.
Hey, thank you. There is another question by Bill Hayton. He points out that there are few international correspondents based in Vietnam, and given that it's the 15th most populous country in the world, and do you think that this means Vietnam's voice is diminished in the international discussion? Who wants to?
Hi,
Yeah,
may
sure,
I answer
please.
this question? Yeah, hey, Bill, I'm a correspondent in Hong Kong, but I seldom cover Hong Kong issues. I cover China issues, so it's not the region that matters. From my past experience, I thought Vietnam is very transparent. Whenever I want to write some South China Sea related issues, I can call Vietnam Foreign Ministry, and they sometimes they would delay the response, but they will give a response. That is better when compared to Chinese ministry's response. Sometimes the people just don't answer your question, or just delay your question, or just don't say they would even to just let you wait and don't give you any reply. So even Vietnam, they won't have any international correspondence. I think they have a pretty good job to reach out to reporters and to let their voice heard.
Can I come on that for 2 seconds?
Sure.
Yeah. So I was a journalist based in Cambodia and took more than a dozen reporting trips to Vietnam over 4 or 5 years. I think if the question is what is meant by the Vietnam perspective, if it means the government, then I agree. The government is very good at speaking to journalists compared to other countries in the region, or even perhaps to the Chinese government. I think if it means talking to the civil society in Vietnam, sometimes to academia, then I think the lack of international reporters based in Vietnam is an impact, and especially around quite sensitive issues. I reported from Hanoi during Trump's North Korea peace talks. I was there primarily to cover it from the Vietnamese perspective, and many of my sources, who I've known for quite a long time, were banned from traveling into center of Hanoi that day or for that entire weekend. So I had to travel an hour, 2 hours outside of Hanoi just to speak to sources. And oftentimes they were followed by police, and oftentimes those police subsequently followed me. So I believe for the media, for the government, it's very open, or at least comparatively open compared to other countries, but not for civil society. And that is impacted by a lack of international media allowed to be based there.
Okay, so we have, the time is now closing, yeah?
Mr. Moderator, if I may send in a question from this conference room in Hanoi, can I?
Sure.
The question from this conference room in Hanoi is, given the fact of, of the reality of the world medias today, full of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda, what is the advice of the extreme distinguished panelists up there to the regular consumer of information on how they should become a smart consumer of information and not become the means for the other to exploit in the, so-called information warfare of today?
I have an answer, but I would like to have one of the panelists answer it. So who wants to talk about it? I think Dr. Prashanth mentioned it partly in his presentation. Like media literacy.
If I could just say, if you can, if you've got the access to it, listen to as many echo chambers as you can. So your mainstream media, say the BBC or the Times in London or New York Times, CNN, but Fox News, but listen to both. So in the South China Sea, watch or listen to Fox News, watch and listen to the Global Times, and then you'll get both of those things, and then look at your own country's newspaper, because then you're going to get the sentiment as much as possible from your own community.
I would just add to that, just track the information down to the source as much as possible. So oftentimes you'll read a story in the New York Times that's citing a particular source. That story may have originally been published in another outlet. That outlet may have sourced it from another individual. So the more that you can get to the granular source of the information, whether it's a particular ministry or a particular expert who's talking about a subject, the better, rather than relying on secondhand information or third-hand information. And the more information you can get about where that original source is getting their funding from, where they're based, who their affiliations are, and the various affiliations that these individuals purport to have and advertise versus the things they don't advertise, I think is really important in this context where you can have people wearing 3 or 4 different hats, and they're advertising one or two, but not the other 1 or 2.
Thank you very much for giving all the answers, for asking all the questions. I'm closing the panel now and the panel discussion. I would like to thank you for being part of this interesting conference and at the last session of the day, and the conference will continue tomorrow. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening or morning, whatever is correct for your region of the world. And xin cảm ơn các quý vị, chúc quý vị một ngày tốt lành. Have a nice day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.